essentially breaks the region up. There's technically contiguity way over through the desert to the east, but it's essentially unviable. And what remains is broken up by hundreds of checkpoints, which are there primarily for harassment. They're moved, so you never know exactly where they're going to be. But it means, for example, that if you want to visit your cousin 2 miles away, it may take you 5 hours to get there if you ever manage. And an ambulance may take, say, 2 hours to get from one spot to a hospital a couple of miles away, because it has to go through checkpoints, and the patient has to be carried over, a big barrier, put in another one on the other side, and so on. These are essentially techniques of harassment. They have no security purpose, even a remote one, but they are perfectly rational to ensure that the population will live like dogs, and if they want to leave, that's fine, they'll leave. That's aside from the actions in what's called Jerusalem, vastly expanded region around what used to be Jerusalem. There, the actions are doubly illegal. They're not only in violation of international law, they're also in violation of explicit Security Council resolutions, barring any modification of the status of Jerusalem. Actually, the U.S. Signed those or joined in those resolutions back in the late 60s and for several years afterwards. So they're doubly illegal, and they continue. I mean, that's what you read every day in the papers about new buildings, taking over of Palestinian homes. There's now, it was just reported that in the last year, Israel radically accelerated its withdrawal of residence status for inhabitants of Jerusalem for whom the courts decided that the center of their life was somewhere else. In that case, you can have your residence removed if you're a Palestinian. There's no case on record that I know of an Israeli who had citizenship reduced because the center of their life is in Los Angeles or New York, for example. So it's just another racist law designed to rid the region of the sort of rabble, the vermin that are in the way. We're kind of familiar with that in American history. It resonates. That's why we're here, basically, because, that's what we did, in the conquest of the national territory, except that the U.S. was much more violent, exterminated the indigenous population. But it's a familiar pattern. I suspect it's part of the reason for the residual sympathy for Israel's activities. It strikes a kind of a chord in our own national history, maybe one we don't like to look at much. Expropriation continues steadily. By now, rough estimates, about a third of the West Bank has been expropriated, converted into state land. Yossi Sarid mentioned recently that this means that Israel can continue settlement for 100 years without expropriating anything any further. That's what continues. Senator Kerry has an interesting stand on this. He's very close to Obama. He's become more or less his foreign policy kind of emissary. He gave the most important speech in the administration of the Obama administration's policies. It was a speech to the Brookings Institution a couple of months ago. Obama took the standard position. The party line is the United States is an honest broker, trying desperately to bring peace to these two difficult antagonists. But he said that, so he repeated that. That's normal. But then he added that for a long time, Israel has been seeking a legitimate partner for peace, and it's never had one. So it's kind of, devastated. Who can we negotiate with? But Kerry said that now, finally, Israel may have a legitimate partner for peace. And he gave his evidence. Can't hear you. You can't hear me? Yeah, okay. Should have told me a little earlier. How's this? Is it any better? No? Any better? No? Yes or no? Can you hear what they're saying?
Could you speak closer into the mic?
How about that? Oh, okay. Trouble is you can't speak close to a mic because you get feedback. Well, I'll try. Sorry you missed all those words of wisdom. But I'll have to leave it to you to make them up. I was talking about Senator Kerry and his formulation of the Obama administration position. He gave a talk a few months ago in which he said that the U.S., of course, has always been an honest broker seeking peace. That's true by definition. You don't need any factual evidence relating to that. And Israel has always been desperately seeking a legitimate partner, and finally it may have had one. What was interesting is it may have one. He gave his evidence. His evidence was that during the U.S.-Israeli attack on Gaza, which he didn't, of course, describe it that way, during the U.S.-Israeli attack on Gaza, there were no protests on the West Bank. It was quiet. Of course, that's the other half of Palestine, but they didn't do anything about it. And he explained why. He said the reason is that the U.S. has established an army, a mercenary army, headed by U.S. General Dayton, trained with the assistance of Jordan and Israel. And the army is able to suppress any sign of resistance to what the U.S. and Israel are doing in Gaza. So things are really looking up. There's a possibility that there might be a legitimate partner controlled by a paramilitary force that is under our command. I should mention that the Dayton Army is under State Department control, meaning at least some kinds of weak restrictions on human rights and other conditionalities. But people in the West who know the West Bank say that there's a much more savage force which is under CIA control, general intelligence, and that's subject to nothing. That's standard all over the world. So we have military forces that can keep the population quiet. There's a collaborationist elite. Living in Ramallah, it's kind of like Tel Aviv, Paris, New York. A lot of money flowing in from the European Union. Cultural life, people live pretty well. A few miles away in the villages, life's entirely different. But this is the model, the perfect model of a neo-colonial society. That's what the U.S. is, and the U.S. has plenty of experience with this. This is the model that was crafted in the Philippines a century ago, after the U.S. conquered the Philippines, to uplift them and Christianize them and so on. All the most noble motives, killing a couple 100,000. There was a problem what you do with them. So a new model of control was developed, which was a real break from the European imperial pattern, and it's pretty much what I described. There's a military force, the Philippine Constabulary, but it has to have a collaborationist elite. The nationalist movement was broken up by various devices, subversion, spreading of rumors, all sorts of other things. And the population was put under very tight surveillance and control, using the highest technology of the day. This is a century ago, so that meant telephone, radio, and so on. And they had extremely tight surveillance of the population, knew where everybody was, and so on. Those techniques were later developed, applied in other U.S. domains, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and so on. And they blew back to the United States very quickly. In fact, Woodrow Wilson applied them in the United States in his during the First World War. And we're familiar with them today, and even more so elsewhere, like Britain. In the West Bank, which is, as Nancy pointed out, an experimental region, the biometric controls are extremely sophisticated. So there's identification of every person by any kind of measure you can think of, all on their identity cards. Pretty soon they'll be in chips put into their brains or something. There's talk of extending these measures to Israel. And there it's arousing a lot of protest, but in the West Bank, no protest. We just do that. So this is a familiar technique, and it works.